Chapter 44. In order to be revenged, I learn the science of defense. We join Marescal Duc de Noailles, are engaged with the allies of Dettingen, and put to flight. The behavior of the French soldiers on that occasion. I industriously seek another combat with the old Gascon, and vanquish him in my turn. Our regiment is put into winter quarters at Reims, where I find my friend Strap. Our recognition. He supplies me with money, and procures my discharge. We take a trip to Paris, from whence, by the way of Flanders, we set out for London, where we safely arrive. He was disconcerted at this declaration, to which he made no reply, but repaired to the dancers, among whom he recounted his victory with many exaggerations and gasconades, while I, taking up my sword, went to my quarters, and examined my wound, which I found was of no consequence. The same day an Irish drummer, having heard of my misfortune, visited me, and after having condoled me on the chance of war, gave me to understand, that he was master of the sword, and would in a very short time instruct me so thoroughly in that noble science, that I should be able to chastise the old Gascon for his insolent boasting at my expense. This friendly office he proffered on pretence of the regard he had for his countrymen, but I afterwards learned the true motive was no other than a jealousy he entertained of a correspondence between the Frenchman and his wife, which he did not think proper to resent in person. Be this as it will, I accepted his offer and practiced his lessons with such application, that I soon believed myself a match for my conqueror. In the meantime we continued our march, and arrived at the camp of Marescal Noailles the night before the battle at Dettingen. Notwithstanding the fatigue we had undergone, our regiment was one of those that were ordered next day to cross the river, under the command of the Duc de Gramont, to take possession of a narrow defile, through which the Allies must of necessity have passed at a great disadvantage, or remain where they were, and perish for want of provision, if they would not condescend to surrender at discretion. How they suffered themselves to be pent up in this manner it is not my province to relate. I shall only observe that, when we had taken possession of our ground, I heard an old officer in conversation with another express a surprise at the conduct of Lord Stair, who had the reputation of a good general. But it seems, at this time, that nobleman was overruled, and only acted in an inferior character, so that no part of the blame could be imputed to him, who declared his disapprobation of the step, in consequence of which the whole army was in the utmost danger, but Providence or Destiny acted miracles in their behalf, by disposing the Duc de Gramont to quit his advantageous post, pass the defile, and attack the English, who were drawn up in order of battle on the plain, and who handled us so roughly that, after having lost a great number of men, we turned our backs without ceremony, and fled with such precipitation that many hundreds perished in the river through pure fear and confusion. For the enemy were so generous that they did not pursue us 1 inch of ground, and, if our consternation would have permitted, we might have retreated with great order and deliberation. But, notwithstanding the royal clemency of the King of Great Britain, who headed the Allies in person, and, no doubt, put a stop to the carnage, our loss amounted to 5,000 men, among whom were many officers of distinction. Our miscarriage opened a passage for the foe to Hainaut, whither they immediately marched, leaving their sick and wounded to the care of the French, who next day took possession of the field of battle, buried the dead, and treated the living with humanity. This circumstance was a great consolation to us, who thence took occasion to claim the victory, and the genius of the French nation never appeared more conspicuous than now, in the rhodomantades they uttered on the subject of their generosity and courage. Every man, by his own account, performed feats that eclipsed all the heroes of antiquity. One compared himself to a lion retiring at leisure from his cowardly pursuers, who keep at a wary distance, and gall him with their darts. Another likened himself to a bear that retreats with his face to the enemy, who dare not assail him, and the third assumed the character of a desperate stag, that turns upon the hounds and keeps them at bay. There was not a private soldier engaged who had not by the prowess of his single arm demolished a whole platoon, or put a squadron of horse to flight, and, among others, the meagre Gascon extolled his exploits above those of Hercules or Charlemagne. As I still retained my resentment for the disgrace I suffered in my last rencontre with him, and, now that I thought myself qualified, longed for an opportunity to retrieve my honor, I magnified the valor of the English with all the hyperboles I could imagine, and described the pusillanimity of the French in the same style, comparing them to hares flying before greyhounds, or mice pursued by cats, and passed an ironical compliment on the speed he exerted in his flight, which, considering his age and infirmities, I said was surprising. He was stung to the quick by this sarcasm, and, with an air of threatening disdain, bade me know myself better, and remember the correction I had already received from him for my insolence, for he might not always be in the humor of sparing a wretch who abused his goodness. To this innuendo I made no reply but by a kick on the breech, which overturned him in an instant. He started up with wonderful agility, and, drawing his sword, attacked me with great fury. Several people interposed, but, when he informed them of its being an affair of honor, they retired, and left us to decide the battle by ourselves. I sustained his onset with little damage, having only received a small scratch on my right shoulder, and, seeing his breath and vigor almost exhausted, assaulted him in my turn, closed with him, and wrested his sword out of his hand in the struggle. Having thus acquired the victory, I desired him to beg his life, to which demand he made no answer, but shrugged up his shoulders to his ears, expanded his hands, elevated the skin on his forehead and eyebrows, and depressed the corners of his mouth in such a manner, that I could scarce refrain from laughing aloud at his grotesque appearance. That I might, however, mortify his vanity, which triumphed without bounds over my misfortune, I thrust his sword up to the hilt in something, it was not a tansy, that lay smoking on the plain, and joined the rest of the soldiers with an air of tranquillity and indifference. There was nothing more of moment attempted by either of the armies during the remaining part of the campaign, which being ended, the English marched back to the Netherlands, part of our army was detached to French Flanders, and our regiment ordered into winter quarters in Champagne. It was the fate of the Grenadier Company, to which I now belonged, to lie at Reims, where I found myself in the utmost want of everything, my pay, which amounted to 5 sols a day, far from supplying me with necessaries, being scarce sufficient to procure a wretched subsistence to keep soul and body together, so that I was, by hunger and hard duty, brought down to the meagre condition of my fellow soldiers, and my linen reduced from 3 tolerable shirts to 2 pair of sleeves and necks, the bodies having been long ago converted into spatterdachs, and after all, I was better provided than any private man in the regiment. In this urgency of my affairs, I wrote to my uncle in England, though my hopes from that quarter were not at all sanguine, for the reasons I have already explained, and in the meantime had recourse to my old remedy patience, consoling myself with the flattering suggestions of a lively imagination, that never abandoned me in my distress. One day, while I stood sentinel at the gate of a general officer, a certain nobleman came to the door, followed by a gentleman in mourning, to whom, at parting, I heard him say, "You may depend upon my good offices." This assurance was answered by a low bow of the person in black, who, turning to go away, discovered to me the individual countenance of my old friend and adherent Strap. I was so much astonished at the sight, that I lost the power of utterance, and, before I could recollect myself, he was gone without taking any notice of me. Indeed, had he stayed, I scarcely should have ventured to accost him, because, though I was perfectly well acquainted with the features of his face, I could not be positively certain as to the rest of his person, which was very much altered for the better since he left me at London, neither could I conceive by which means he was enabled to appear in the sphere of a gentleman, to which, while I knew him, he had not even the ambition to aspire. But I was too much concerned in the affair to neglect further information, and therefore took the first opportunity of asking the porter if he knew the gentleman to whom the Marquis spoke. The Swiss told me his name was Monsieur d'Estrapes, that he had been valet-de-chamber to an English gentleman lately deceased, and that he was very much regarded by the Marquis for his fidelity to his master, between whom and that nobleman a very intimate friendship had subsisted. Nothing could be more agreeable to me than this piece of intelligence, which banished all doubt of its being my friend, who had found means to Frenchify his name as well as his behavior since we parted. As soon, therefore, as I was relieved, I went to his lodging, according to a direction given me by the Swiss, and had the good fortune to find him at home. That I might surprise him the more, I concealed my name and business, and only desired the servant of the house to tell Monsieur d'Estrapes that I begged the honor of half an hour's conversation with him. He was confounded and dismayed at this message, when he understood it was sent by a soldier, though he was conscious to himself of no crime. All that he had heard of the Bastille appeared to his imagination with aggravated horror, but it was not before I had waited a considerable time that he had resolution enough to bid the servant show me upstairs. When I entered his chamber, he returned my bow with great civility, and endeavored, with forced complaisance, to disguise his fear, which appeared in the paleness of his face, the wildness of his looks, and the shaking of his limbs. I was diverted at his consternation, which redoubled, when I told him in French, I had business for his private ear and demanded a particular audience. The valet being withdrawn, I asked in the same language if his name was d'Estrapes, to which he answered with a faltering tongue, the same, at your service. Are you a Frenchman? Said I have not the honor of being a Frenchman born, replied he, but I have an infinite veneration for the country. I then desired he would do me the honor to look at me, which he no sooner did than, struck with my appearance, he started back, and cried in English, "Oh Jesus, sure it can't. No, 'tis impossible." I smiled at his interjections, saying, I suppose you are too much of a gentleman to own your friend in adversity. When he heard me pronounce these words in our own language, he leaped upon me in a transport of joy, hung about my neck, kissed me from ear to ear, and blubbered like a great schoolboy who had been whipped. Then, observing my dress, he set up his throat, crying, "O Lord! O Lord! That ever I should live to see my dearest friend reduced to the condition of a foot soldier in the French service. Why did you consent to my leaving you? But I know the reason. You thought you had got more creditable friends, and grew ashamed of my acquaintance. Ah! Lord help us! Though I was a little short-sighted, I was not altogether blind, and though I did not complain, I was not the less sensible of your unkindness, which was indeed the only thing that induced me to ramble abroad, the Lord knows whither, but I must own it has been a lucky ramble for me, and so I forgive you, and may God forgive you. O Lord! Lord! Is it come to this? I was nettled at the charge, which, though just, I could not help thinking unseasonable, and told him with some tartness that, whether his suspicions were well or ill-grounded, he might have chosen a more convenient opportunity of introducing them, and that the question now was whether or no he found himself disposed to lend me any assistance. Disposed, replied he with great emotion, I thought you had known me so well as to assure yourself without asking, that I, and all that belongs to me, are at your command. In the meantime you shall dine with me, and I will tell you something that, perhaps, will not be displeasing unto you. Then, wringing my hand, he said, It makes my heart bleed to see you in that garb. I thanked him for his invitation, which, I observed, could not be unwelcome to a person who had not eaten a comfortable meal these 7 months, but I had another request to make, which I begged he would grant before dinner, and that was the loan of a shirt, for although my back had been many weeks a stranger to any comfort of that kind, my skin was not yet familiarized to the want of it. He stared in my face, with a woeful countenance, at this declaration, which he could scarce believe, until I explained it by unbuttoning my coat and disclosing my naked body, a circumstance which shocked the tender-hearted Strap, who, with tears in his eyes, ran to a chest of drawers, and taking out some linen, presented to me a very fine ruffled Holland shirt and cambric neckcloth, assuring me he had 3 dozen of the same kind at my service. I was ravished at this piece of good news and, having accommodated myself in a moment, hugged my benefactor for his generous offer, saying, I was overjoyed to find him undebauched by prosperity, which seldom fails to corrupt the heart. He bespoke for dinner some soup and bouillie, a couple of pullets roasted, and a dish of asparagus, and in the interim entertained me with biscuit and burgundy, after which repast he entreated me to gratify his longing desire of knowing every circumstance of my fortune since his departure from London. This request I complied with, beginning at the adventure of Gawky, and relating every particular event in which I had been concerned from that day to the present hour. During the recital, my friend was strongly affected, according to the various situations described. He stared with surprise, glowed with indignation, gaped with curiosity, smiled with pleasure, trembled with fear, and wept with sorrow, as the vicissitudes of my life inspired these different passions, and, when my story was ended, signified his amazement on the whole, by lifting up his eyes and hands and protesting that, though I was a young man, had suffered more than all the blessed martyrs. After dinner, I desired in my turn to know the particulars of his peregrination, and he satisfied me in a few words, by giving me to understand that he had lived a year at Paris with his master, who, in that time having acquired the language, as well as the fashionable exercises to perfection, made a tour of France and Holland, during which excursion he was so unfortunate as to meet with 3 of his own countrymen on their travels, in whose company he committed such excesses, that his constitution failed, and he fell into a consumption, that by the advice of physicians, he went to Montpellier for the benefit of good air, and recovered so well in 6 weeks, that he returned to Reims seemingly in good health, where he had not continued above a month, when he was seized with a looseness that carried him off in 10 days, to the unspeakable sorrow of all who knew him and especially of Strap, who had been very happy in his service, and given such satisfaction, that his master, on his deathbed recommended him to several persons of distinction for his diligence, sobriety, and affection, and left him by will his wearing apparel, gold watch, sword, rings, ready money, and all the movables he had in France, to the value of £300, which I now, said he, in the sight of God and man, surrender to your absolute disposal. Here are my keys, take them, I beseech you, and God give you joy of the possession. My brain was almost turned by this sudden change of fortune, which I could scarce believe real. However, I positively refused this extravagant proffer of my friend, and put him in mind of my being a soldier, at which hint he started, crying, "Ought so. That's true. We must procure your discharge. I have some interest with a nobleman who is able to do me that favor." We consulted about this affair, and it was determined that Monsieur d'Estrapes should wait upon the Marquis in the morning, and tell him he had by accident found his brother, whom he had not seen for many years before, a private soldier in the regiment of Picardy, and implore that nobleman's interest for his discharge. In the meantime, we enjoyed ourselves over a bottle of good Burgundy, and spent the evening in concerting schemes for our future conduct, in case I should be so lucky as to get rid of the army. The business was to make ourselves easy for life by means of his legacy, a task very difficult, and, in the usual methods of laying out money, altogether impracticable, so that, after much canvassing, we could come to no resolution that night, but when we parted, recommended the matter to the serious attention of each other. As for my own part, I puzzled my imagination to no purpose. When I thought of turning merchant, the smallness of our stock, and the risk of seas, enemies, and markets, deterred me from that scheme. If I should settle as a surgeon in my own country, I would find the business already overstocked, or, if I pretended to set up in England, must labor under want of friends and powerful opposition, obstacles insurmountable by the most shining merit. Neither should I succeed in my endeavors to rise in the state, inasmuch as I could neither flatter nor pimp for courtiers, nor prostitute my pen in defense of a wicked and contemptible administration. Before I could form any feasible project, I fell asleep, and my fancy was blessed with the image of the dear Narcissa, who seemed to smile upon my passion, and offer her hand as a reward for all my toils. Early in the morning, I went to the lodgings of my friend, whom I found exulting over his happy invention. For I no sooner entered his apartment, than he addressed himself to me in these words, with a smile of self-applause: "Well, Mr. Random, a lucky thought may come into a fool's head sometimes. I have hit it, I'll hold you a button. My plan is better than yours, for all your learning. But you shall have the preference in this as in all other things, therefore proceed, and let us know the effects of your meditation, and then I will impart my own simple excogitations." I told him, that not one thought had occurred to me which deserved the least notice, and signified my impatience to be acquainted with the fruits of his reflection. "As we have not," said he, "money sufficient to maintain us during a tedious expectation, it is my opinion that a bold push must be made, and I see none so likely to succeed as your appearing in the character of a gentleman, which is your due, and making your addresses to some lady of fortune, who can render you independent at once. Nay, don't stare, I affirm that this scheme is both prudent and honorable, for I would not have you throw yourself away upon an old toothless wheezing dame, whose breath would stink you into a consumption in less than 3 months, neither would I advise you to assume the character of a wealthy squire, as your common fortune hunters do, by which means many a poor lady is cheated into matrimony, and instead of enjoying the pomp and grandeur that was promised, sees her dowry seized by her husband's rapacious creditors, and herself reduced to misery and despair. No, I know you have a soul that disdains such imposition, and are master of qualifications, both of mind and body, which alone entitle you to a match that will set you above the world. I have clothes in my possession that a duke need not be ashamed to wear. I believe they will fit you as they are, if not there are plenty of tailors in France. Let us take a short trip to Paris, and provide ourselves with all other necessaries, then set out for England, where I intend to do myself the honor of attending you in quality of a valet. This expedient will save you the expense of a servant, shaving, and dressing, and I doubt not but, by the blessing of God, we shall bring matters to a speedy and fortunate issue. Extravagant as this proposal was, I listened to it with pleasure, because it flattered my vanity, and indulged a ridiculous hope I began to entertain of inspiring Narcissa with a mutual flame. After breakfast, Monsieur d'Estrapes went to pay his devoirs to the Marquis, and was so successful in his application, that I obtained a discharge in a few days, upon which we set out for Paris. Here I had time to reflect and congratulate myself upon this sudden transition of fate, which to bear with moderation required some degree of philosophy and self-denial. This truth will be more obvious, if I give a detail of the particulars, to the quiet possession of which I was raised in an instant, from the most abject misery and contempt. My wardrobe consisted of 5 fashionable coats full mounted, 2 of which were plain, 1 of cut velvet, 1 trimmed with gold, and another with silver lace, 2 frocks, 1 of white drab, with large plate buttons, the other of blue with gold binding, 1 waistcoat of gold brocade, 1 of blue satin, embroidered with silver, 1 of green silk, trimmed with figured broad gold lace, 1 of black silk, with fringes, 1 of white satin, 1 of black cloth, and 1 of scarlet, 6 pair of cloth breeches, 1 pair of crimson, and another of black velvet, 12 pair of white silk stockings, as many of black silk, and the same number of white cotton, 1 hat, laced with gold point d'Espagne, another with silver lace scalloped, a third with gold binding, and a 4th plain, 3 dozen of fine ruffled shirts, as many neckcloths, 1 dozen of cambric handkerchiefs, and the like number of silk. The other movables, which I possessed by the generosity and friendship of Strap, were a gold watch with a chased case, 2 valuable diamond rings, 2 mourning swords, 1 with a silver handle, and a 4th cut steel inlaid with gold, a diamond stock buckle, and a set of stone buckles for the knees and shoes, a pair of silver-mounted pistols with rich housings, a gold-headed cane, and a snuff-box of tortoiseshell, mounted with gold, having the picture of a lady in the top. The gentleman left many other things of value, which my friend had converted into cash before I met with him, so that, over and above these particulars, our stock in ready money amounted to something more than £200. Thus equipped, I put on the gentleman of figure, and, attended by my honest friend, who was contented with the station of my valet, visited the Louvre, examined the Gallery of Luxembourg, and appeared at Versailles, where I had the honor of seeing His Most Christian Majesty eat a considerable quantity of olives. During the month I spent at Paris, I went several times to court, the Italian comedy, opera, and playhouse, danced at a masquerade, and, in short, saw everything remarkable in and about that capital. Then we set out for England by the way of Flanders, passed through Brussels, Ghent, and Bruges, and took shipping at Ostend, from whence, in 14 hours, we arrived at Deal, hired a post-chaise, and in 12 hours more got safe to London, having disposed of our heavy baggage in the wagon. Chapter 45. I inquire for my uncle, and understand he is gone to sea, take lodgings at Charing Cross, go to the play, where I meet with an adventure, dine at an ordinary, the guests described, become acquainted with Medlar and Dr. Wagtail. As soon as we alighted at the inn, I dispatched Strap to inquire for my uncle at the Union Flag in Wapping, and he returned in a little time, with an account of Mr. Bowling's having gone to sea, mate of a merchant ship, after a long and unsuccessful application attendance at the Admiralty, where, it seems, the interest he depended upon was not sufficient to reinstate him, or recover the pay that was due to him when he quitted the Thunder. Next day I hired very handsome lodgings not far from Charing Cross, and in the evening dressed myself in a plain suit of the true Paris cut, and appeared in a front box at the play, where I saw a good deal of company, and was vain enough to believe that I was observed with an uncommon degree of attention and applause. This silly conceit intoxicated me so much, that I was guilty of 1,000 ridiculous coquetries, and I dare say, how favourable soever the thoughts of the company might be at my first appearance, they were soon changed by my absurd behaviour into pity or contempt. I rose and sat down, covered and uncovered my head 20 times between the acts, pulled out my watch, clapped it to my ear, wound it up, set it, gave it the hearing again, displayed my snuff-box, affected to take snuff, that I might have all opportunity of showing my brilliant, and wiped my nose with perfumed handkerchief, then dangled my cane, and adjusted my sword knot, and acted many more fooleries of the same kind, in hopes of obtaining the character of a pretty fellow, in the acquiring of which I found two considerable obstructions in my disposition, namely, a natural reserve and jealous sensibility. Fain would I have entered into conversation with the people around me, but I was restrained by the fear of being censured for my assurance, as well as by reflecting that I was more entitled to a compliment of this kind from them, than they to such condescension from a stranger like me. How often did I redden at the frequent whispers and loud laughter of my fellow beaux, which I imagined were excited by me, and how often did I envy the happy indifference of those choice spirits, who behold the distress of the scene without discovering the least symptom of approbation or concern. My attention was engaged in spite of myself, and I could not help weeping with the heroine of the stage, though I practiced a great many shifts to conceal this piece of unpolite weakness. When the play was ended, I sat waiting for an opportunity of handing some lady to her coach, but everyone was attended by such a number of officious gallants, that for a long time I was balked in my expectation. At length, however, I perceived a very handsome creature, genteelly dressed, sitting by herself in a box, at some distance from me, upon which I went up to her, and offered my service. She seemed to be in some confusion, thanked me for my complaisance, and with a tender look declined giving me the trouble, looking at her watch, and testifying her surprise at the negligence of her footman whom she had ordered to have a chair ready for her at that hour. I repeated my entreaty with all the eloquence and compliment I was master of, and, in the event, she was prevailed upon to accept of a proposal I made, to send my servant for a chair or coach. Accordingly, Strap was detached for that purpose, and returned without success. By this time the playhouse was quite empty, and we were obliged to retire. As I led her through the passage, I observed 5 or 6 young fellows of fashion standing in a corner, one of whom, as I thought, tipped my charmer the wink, and when we were past, I heard a loud laugh. This note aroused my attention, and I was resolved to be fully satisfied of this lady's character, before I should have any nearer connection with her. As no convenience appeared, I proposed to conduct her to a tavern, where we might stay a few minutes, until my servant could fetch a coach from the Strand. She seemed particularly shy of trusting herself in a tavern with a stranger, but at last yielded to my pathetic remonstrances, rather than endanger her health by remaining in a cold, damp thoroughfare. Having thus far succeeded, I begged to know what wine she would be pleased to drink a glass of, but she professed the greatest aversion to all sorts of strong liquors, and it was with much difficulty that I could persuade her to eat a jelly. In the meantime, I endeavoured to alleviate the uneasiness she discovered, by saying all the agreeable things I could think of, at which she would often sigh, and regard me with a languishing look, that seemed, however, too near akin to the lewd leer of a courtesan. This discovery added to my former suspicion, while it put me upon my guard against her arts, divested me of reserve, and enabled me to entertain her with gaiety and freedom. In the course of our conversation, I pressed her to allow me the honour of waiting upon her next day at her lodgings, a request which she, with many apologues, refused, lest it should give umbrage to Sir John, who was of a disposition apt to be fretted with trifles. This information, by which I was to understand that her husband was a knight, did not check my addresses, which became more and more importunate, and I was even hearty enough to ravish a kiss. But, oh heavens! Instead of banqueting on the ambrosial flavor that her delicacy of complexion promised, I was almost suffocated with the steams of Geneva. An exhalation of this kind, from a mouth which had just before declared an utter abhorrence of all spirituous liquors, not only changed my doubts into certainty, but my raptures into loathing, and it would have been impossible for me to have preserved common complaisance 5 minutes longer, when my servant returned with a coach. I took the advantage of this occasion, and presented my hand to the lady, who put in practice against me the whole artillery of her charms, ogling, languishing, sighing, and squeezing, with so little reserve that Strap perceived her tenderness, and rubbed his hands with joy as he followed us to the door, but I was proof against all her endearments, and handed her into the coach with an intention to take my leave immediately. She guessed my design, and invited me to her house, whispering, that now Sir John was gone to bed, she could have the pleasure of my conversation for half an hour without interruption. I told her there was no mortification I would not undergo, rather than endanger the repose of her ladyship, and, bidding the coachman drive on, wished her a good night. She lost all temper at my indifference, and, stopping the coach, at the distance of about 20 yards from me, popped out her head, and howled with the lungs of a fish-woman, "D.N.U., you dog, won't you pay the coach hire?" As I made no answer, she held forth against me with an eloquence peculiar to herself, calling me pitiful fellow, scoundrel, and 100 such appellations, concluding with an oath, that, for all my appearance, she believed I had got no money in my pocket. Having thus vented her indignation, she ordered her coachman to proceed, and I returned to the tavern, where I bespoke something for supper, very well pleased at the issue of this adventure. I dispensed with the attendance of the waiter at table, on pretence that my own servant was present, and, when we were alone, said to Strap, "Well, Monsieur d'Estrapes, what do you think of this lady?" My friend, who had not opened his mouth since her departure, could make no other reply than the monosyllable, "think," which he pronounced with a note of fear and astonishment. Surprised at this emphasis, I surveyed my valet, and, perceiving a wildness in his looks, asked if he had seen his grandfather's ghost. "Ghost," said he, "I am sure I have seen a devil incarnate. Who would have thought that so much devilish malice and Billingsgate could lurk under so much sweetness of countenance and modesty of behavior? Ah! God help us! Fronti nulla fides, nimium any creed colori, but we ought to down on our knees, and bless God for delivering us from the jaws of that painted sepulchre." I was pretty much of Strap's opinion, and, though I did not believe myself in any danger from the allurements of that sisterhood, I determined to act with great circumspection for the future, and shun all commerce of that kind, as equally prejudicial to my purse and constitution. My next care was to introduce myself into a set of good acquaintance, for which purpose I frequented a certain coffee-house, noted for the resort of good company, English as well as foreigners, where my appearance procured all the civilities and advances I could desire. As there was an ordinary in the same house, I went upstairs to dinner with the other guests, and found myself at a table with 13 people, the greatest part of whom were better dressed than myself. The conversation, which was mostly carried on in French, turned chiefly on politics, and I soon found the whole company were in the French interest, myself excepted, and a testy old gentleman, who contradicted everything that was advanced in favor of his most Christian Majesty, with a surliness truly English. But this trusty patriot, who had never been out of his own country, and drew all his maxims and notions from prejudice and hearsay, was very unequal to his antagonists, who were superior to him in learning and experience, and often took the liberty of travelers in asserting things which were not strictly true, because they thought themselves in no danger of being detected by him. The claim of the Queen of Spain to the Austrian dominions in Italy was fully explained and vindicated, by a person who sat opposite to me, and, by the solemnity of his manner and the richness of his apparel, seemed to be a foreign ambassador. This dissertation produced another on the pragmatic sanction, handled with great warmth by a young gentleman at my right hand, dressed in a green frock, trimmed with gold, who justified the French king for his breach of that contract, and affirmed that he could not have observed it without injuring his own glory. Although I was not at all convinced by this gentleman's arguments, I could not help admiring his vivacity which, I imagined, must be the effect of his illustrious birth and noble education, and accordingly rated him, in my conjecture, as a young prince on his travels. The discourse was afterwards shifted by an old gentleman, of a very martial appearance, to the last campaign, when the battle of Dettingen was fought over again, with so many circumstances to the honor of the French and disadvantages if the Allies, that I began to entertain some doubts of my having been there in person, and took the liberty to mention some objections to what he advanced. This freedom introduced a dispute, which lasted a good while, to the mortification of all present, and was at last referred to the determination of a grave person, whom they styled doctor, and who, under a show of great moderation, decided it against me, with so little regard to truth, that I taxed him with partiality in pretty severe terms, to the no small entertainment of the true English politician, who rejoiced at my defence of a cause he had so often espoused without success. My opponent, pleased with the victory he had gained, affected a great deal of candour, and told me, he should not have been so positive, if he had not been at great pains to inform himself of each particular. Indeed, said he, I am convinced that the previous steps considered, things could not happen otherwise, for we generals who have seen service, though we may not be on the spot ourselves, know by the least sketch of the disposition what must be the event. He then censured, with great freedom, every circumstance of the conduct of those who commanded the Allies, from thence made a transition to the ministry, which he honored with many invectives for employing people who had neither experience nor capacity, to the prejudice of old officers, who had been distinguished for both, dropped many hints of his own importance, and concluded with observing, that the French and Spaniards knew better how to value generals of merit, the good effects of which are seen in the conquests they gain, and the discipline of their troops, which are at the same time better clothed and paid than any soldiers in the universe. These remarks furnished the Green Knight with an opportunity of launching out in the praise of the French government in general, civil as well as military, on which occasion he made many odious comparisons to the disadvantage of the English. Everybody, almost, assented to the observations he made, and the doctor gave his sanction, by saying, the people of France were undoubtedly the happiest subjects in the world. I was so much astonished and confounded at their infatuation and effrontery, that I had not power to utter one word in opposition to their assertions, but my morose associate could not put up with the indignity that was offered to Old England, and therefore with a satirical grin addressed himself to the general in these words, Sir, I have often heard it said, she's a villainous bird that befouls her own nest. As for what those people who are foreigners say, I don't mind it, they know no better, but you who were bred and born, and have got your bread, under the English government, should have more regard to gratitude, as well as truth in censuring your native country. If the ministry have thought fit to lay you aside, I suppose they have their own reasons for so doing, and you ought to remember, that you still live on the bounty of this nation. As for these gentlemen, meaning the prince and ambassador, who make so free with our constitution, laws, and genius of our people, I think they might show a little more respect for their benefactors, who, I must own, are to blame in harboring and protecting, and encouraging such ungrateful vagrants as they are. At these words, the chevalier in green started up in a great passion, and laying his hand on the hilt of his hanger, exclaimed, Ah! Fautre! The Englishman on the other hand, grasping his cane cried, Don't fautre me, sirrah, or by G. D. I'll knock you down. The company interposed, the Frenchman sat down again, and his antagonist proceeded, Look ye, monsieur, you know very well that had you dared to speak so freely of the administration of your own country in Paris as you have done of ours in London, you would have been sent to the Bastille without ceremony, where you might have rotted in a dungeon, and never seen the light of the sun again. Now, sir, take my word for it, although our constitution screens us from such oppression, we want not laws to chastise the authors of seditious discourse, and if I hear another syllable out of your mouth in contempt or prejudice of this kingdom, I will give you a convincing proof of what I advance, and have you laid by the heels for your presumption. This declaration had an effect on the company as sudden as surprising. The young prince became as supple as a spaniel, the ambassador trembled, the general sat silent and abashed, and the doctor, who it seems, had felt the rod of power, grew pale as death, and assured us all, that he had no intention to affront any person or people. "Your principles, doctor," resumed the old gentleman, "are no secret. I have nothing to say upon that head, but am very much surprised, that a man who despises us so much, should notwithstanding live among us, when he has no visible motive for so doing. Why don't you take up your habitation in your beloved France, where you may rail at England without censure?" To this remonstrance the doctor thought proper to make no reply, and an unsocial silence ensued, which I perceiving, took notice, that it was pity such idle disputes, maintained very often through whim or diversion, should create any misunderstanding among gentlemen of good sense, and proposed to drink down all animosity in another bottle. This motion was applauded by the whole company. The wine was brought, and the English champion, declaring he had no spleen against any man for differing in opinion from him, any more than for difference of complexion, drank to the good health of all present, the compliment was returned, and the conversation once more became unreserved though more general than before. Among other topics, the subject of war was introduced, on which the general declaimed with great eloquence, recounting many of his own exploits by way of illustration. In the course of his harangue he happened to mention the word epaulement, upon which the testy gentleman asked the meaning of that term. "I'll tell you what an epaulement is," replied he. "I never saw an epaulement but once, and that was at the siege of Namur. In a council of war, Monsieur Cohorn, the famous engineer, affirmed that the place could not be taken. 'Yes,' said the Prince of Vandemont, 'it may be taken by an epaulement.' This was immediately put into execution, and in 24 hours Mareschal Boufflers was fain to capitulate." Here he made a full stop, and the old gentleman repeated the question, "But pray what is an epaulement?" To this interrogation the officer made no immediate reply, but rang the bell, and called for the bill, which being brought, he threw down his proportion of the reckoning, and, telling the company he would show them an epaulement when His Majesty should think fit to entrust him with the command of our army abroad, strutted away with great dignity. I could not imagine why he was so shy of explaining one of the most simple terms of fortification, which I forthwith described as a sidework composed of earth, gabions, or fascines, but I was very much surprised when I afterwards understood that his reserve proceeded from his ignorance. Having paid our bill, we adjourned to the coffee-room, where my fellow laborer insisted on treating me with a dish, giving me to understand, at the same time, that I had acquired his good opinion, both with respect to my principles and understanding. I thanked him for his compliment, and, professing myself an utter stranger in this part of the world, begged he would have the goodness to inform me of the quality and characters of the people who dined above. This request was a real favor to one of his disposition, which was no less communicative than curious. He therefore complied with great satisfaction, and told me, to my extreme astonishment, that the supposed young prince was a dancer at one of the theatres, and the ambassador no other than a fiddler belonging to the opera. "The doctor," said he, "is a Roman Catholic priest, who sometimes appears in the character of an officer, and assumes the name of captain, but more generally takes the garb, title, and behavior of a physician, in which capacity he wheedles himself into the confidence of weak-minded people, and by arguments no less specious than false, converts them from their religion and allegiance. He has been in the hands of justice more than once for such practices, but he is a sly dog, and manages matters with so much craft, that hitherto he has escaped for a short imprisonment. As for the general, you may see he has owed his promotion more to his interests than his capacity, and, now that the eyes of the ministry are opened, his friends dead or become inconsiderable, he is struck off the list, and obliged to put up with a yearly pension. In consequence of this reduction, he has become malcontent, and inveighs against the government in all companies, with so little discretion, that I am surprised at the lenity of the administration, in overlooking his insolence, but the truth of the matter is, he owes his safety to his weakness and want of importance. He has seen a little, and but a little, service, and yet, if you will take his word to it, there has not been a great action performed in the field since the Revolution, in which he was not principally concerned. When a story is told of any great general, he immediately matches it with one of himself, though he is often unhappy in his invention, and commit such gross blunders in the detail, that everybody is in pain for him. Caesar, Pompey, and Alexander the Great, are continually in his mouth, and, as he reads a good deal without any judgment to digest it, his ideas are confused, and his harangues as unintelligible as infinite, for, if once he begin, there is no chance of his leaving off speaking while one person remains to yield attention. Therefore the only expedient I know, for putting a stop to his loquacity, is to lay hold of some incongruity he has uttered, and demand an explanation, or ask the meaning of some difficult term that he knows by name. This method will effectually put him to silence, if not to flight, as it happened when I inquired about an epaulement. Had he been acquainted with the signification of that word, his triumph would have been intolerable, and we must have quitted the field first, or been worried with impertinence. Having thus gratified my curiosity, the old gentleman began to discover his own, in questions relating to myself, to which I thought proper to return ambiguous answers. "I presume, sir," said he, "you have travelled." I answered, "Yes." "I dare say you have found it very expensive," said he. I replied, "To be sure, one cannot travel without money." "That I know by experience," said he, "for I myself take a trip to Bath or Tunbridge every season, and one must pay sauce for what he has on the road, as well in other countries as in this. That's a pretty stone in your ring. Give me leave, sir, the French have attained to a wonderful skill in making compositions of this kind." "Why, now, this looks almost as well as a diamond." "Almost as well, sir," said I, "why not altogether? I am sure if you understand anything of jewels, you must perceive, at first sight, that this stone is a real diamond, and that of a very fine water. Take it in your hand and examine it." He did so with some confusion, and returned it, saying, "I ask your pardon, I see it is a true brilliant of immense value." I imagined his respect to me increased after this inquiry, therefore to captivate his esteem the more, I told him, I would show him a seal of composition, engraved after a very valuable antique, upon which I pulled out my watch with a rich gold chain, adorned with 3 seals set in gold, and an opal ring. He viewed each of them with great eagerness, handled the chain, admired the chased case, and observed that the whole must have cost me a vast sum of money. I affected indifference, and replied in a careless manner, some trifle of 60 or 70 guineas. He stared in my face for some time, and then asked if I was an Englishman. I answered in the negative. "You are from Ireland then, sir, I presume," said he. I made the same reply. "Oh, perhaps," said he, "you were born in one of our settlements abroad." I still answered no. He seemed very much surprised, and said, he was sure I was not a foreigner. I made no reply, but left him upon the tenterhooks of impatient uncertainty. He could not contain his anxiety, but asked pardon for the liberties he had taken and, to encourage me the more to disclose my situation, displayed his own without reserve. "I am," said he, "a single man, have a considerable annuity, on which I live according to my inclination, and make the ends of the year meet very comfortably. As I have no estate to leave behind, I am not troubled with the importunate officiousness of relations or legacy hunters, and I consider the world as made for me, not me for the world. It is my maxim, therefore, to enjoy it while I can, and let futurity shift for itself." While he thus indulged his own talkative vein, and at the same time, no doubt, expected retaliation from me, a young man entered, dressed in black velvet and an enormous tie wig, with an air in which natural levity and affected solemnity were so jumbled together, that on the whole he appeared a burlesque on all decorum. This ridiculous oddity danced up to the table at which we sat, and, after 1,000 grimaces, asked my friend by the name of Mr. Medlar, if we were not engaged upon business. My companion put on a surly countenance, and replied, "No great business, doctor, but however, oh." "Then," cried the physician, "I must beg your indulgence a little, pray pardon me, gentlemen." "Sir," said he, addressing himself to me, "your most humble servant. I hope you will forgive me, sir, I must beg the favor to sit, sir, I have something of consequence to impart to my friend Mr. Medlar, Sir, I hope you will excuse my freedom in whispering. Sir, before I had time to give this complaisant person my permission, Mr. Medlar cried, I'll have no whispering. If you have anything to say to me, speak with an audible voice. The doctor seemed a little disconcerted at this exclamation, and, turning again to me, made 1,000 apologies for pretending to make a mystery of anything, a piece of caution which he said was owing to his ignorance of my connection with Mr. Medlar, but now he understood I was a friend, and would communicate what he had to say in my hearing. He then began, after 2 or 3 hems, in this manner, You must know, sir, I am just come from dinner at my Lady Flareite's, then addressing himself to me, a lady of quality, sir, at whose table I have the honour of dining sometimes. There was Lady Stately and my Lady Larum, and Mrs. Dainty, and Miss Biddy Giggler, upon my word, a very good-natured young lady, with a very pretty fortune, sir. There was also my Lord Straddle, Sir John Shrug, and Master Billy Chatter, who is actually a very facetious young gentleman. So, sir, her ladyship seeing me excessively fatigued, for she was the last of 15 patients, people of distinction, sir, whom I had visited this forenoon, insisted upon my staying dinner, though upon my word I protest I had no appetite. However, in compliance with her ladyship's request, sir, I sat down, and the conversation turning on different subjects, among other things, Mr. Chatter asked very earnestly when I saw Mr. Medlar. I told him I had not had the pleasure of seeing you these 19 hours and a half, for you may remember, sir, it was nearly about that time, I won't be positive as to a minute. No, says he, then I desire you will go to his lodgings immediately after dinner, and see what's the matter with him, for he must certainly be very bad from having eaten last night such a vast quantity of raw oysters. The crusty gentleman, who, from the solemnity of his delivery, expected something extraordinary, no sooner heard his conclusion, than he started up in a testy humour, crying, Shaw, Shaw. D.N. your oysters, and walked away, after a short compliment of, Your servant, sir, to me. The doctor got up also, saying, I vow and protest, upon my word, I am actually amazed, and followed Mr. Medlar to the bar, which was hard by, where he was paying for his coffee. There he whispered so loud that I could overhear, Pray who is this gentleman? His friend replied hastily, I might have known that before now, if it had not been for your impertinent intrusion, and walked off very much disappointed. The ceremonious physician returned immediately and sat down by me, asking 1,000 pardons for leaving me alone, and giving me to understand that what he had communicated to Mr. Medlar at the bar was an affair of the last importance, that would admit of no delay. He then called for some coffee, and launched out into the virtues of that berry, which, he said, in cold phlegmatic constitutions, like his, dried up the superfluous moisture, and braced the relaxed nerves. He told me it was utterly unknown to the ancients, and derived its name from an Arabian word, which I might easily perceive by the sound and termination. From this topic he transferred his disquisitions to the verb drink, which he affirmed was improperly applied to the taking of coffee, inasmuch as people did not drink, but sip or sipple that liquor, that the genuine meaning of drinking is to quench one's thirst, or commit a debauch by swallowing wine, that the Latin word, which conveyed the same idea, was bibera or potar, and that of the Greeks painein or potein, though he was apt to believe they were differently used on different occasions. For example, to drink a vast quantity, or, as the vulgar express it, to drink an ocean of liquor, was in Latin potar, and in Greek potein, and, on the other hand, to use it moderately, was bibera and painein, that this was only a conjecture of his, which, however, seemed to be supported by the word bibulus, which is particularly applied to the pores of the skin, and can only drink a very small quantity of the circumambient moisture, by reason of the smallness of their diameters, whereas, from the verb potein is derived the substantive potamus, which signifies a river, or vast quantity of liquor. I could not help smiling at this learned and important investigation, and, to recommend myself the more to my new acquaintance, whose disposition I was by this time well informed of, I observed that, what he alleged, did not, to the best of my remembrance, appear in the writings of the ancients, for Horace uses the words poto and bibbo indifferently for the same purpose, as in the 20th ode of his first book. Vile potabis modicis sabinum cantharus. Et proello domitam calino tu bibs juvum. That I had never heard of the verb potian, but that potamus, potima, and potos, were derived from pino, poso, pipoca, in consequence of which, the Greek poets never use any other word for festal drinking. Homer describes Nestor at his cups in these words, Nestora diuc elathan iach penanta paremps. And Anacreon mentions it on the same occasion always in every page. Penanti de oinen haduan. Oten pino ton oinen. Oplies ego de pino. And in 1,000 other places. The doctor, who doubtless intended by his criticism to give me a high idea of his erudition, was infinitely surprised to find himself schooled by one of my appearance, and after a considerable pause cried, "Upon my word, you are in the right, sir. I find I have not considered this affair with my usual accuracy." Then, accosting me in Latin, which he spoke very well, the conversation was maintained full 2 hours, on a variety of subjects, in that language, and indeed he spoke so judiciously, that I was convinced, notwithstanding his whimsical appearance and attention to trifles, that he was a man of extensive knowledge, especially in books. He looked upon me, as I afterwards understood from Mr. Medlar, as a prodigy in learning, and proposed that very night, if I were not engaged, to introduce me to several young gentlemen of fortune and fashion, with whom I had an appointment at the Bedford Coffee House. Chapter 46. Wagtail introduces me to a set of fine gentlemen with whom I spend the evening at a tavern, our conversation, the characters of my new companions, the doctor is roasted, our issue of our debauch. I accepted his offer with pleasure, and we went thither in a hackney coach where I saw a great number of gay figures fluttering about, most of whom spoke to the doctor with great familiarity. Among the rest stood a group of them round the fire whom I immediately knew to be the very persons who had the night before, by their laughing, alarmed my suspicion of the lady who had put herself under my protection. They no sooner perceived me enter with Dr. Wagtail, for that was my companion's name, than they tittered and whispered one to another, and I was not a little surprised to find that they were the gentlemen to whose acquaintance he designed to recommend me, for, when he observed them together, he told me who they were, and desired to know by what name he should introduce me. I satisfied him in that particular, and he advanced with great gravity, saying, "Gentlemen, your most obedient servant, give me leave to introduce my friend Mr. Random to your society." Then, turning to me, "Mr. Random, this is Mr. Bragwell, Mr. Banter, sir, Mr. Chatter, my friend Mr. Slyboot, and Mr. Ranter, sir." I saluted each of them in order, and when I came to take Mr. Slyboot by the hand, I perceived him thrust his tongue in his cheek, to the no small entertainment of the company, but I did not think proper to take any notice of it on this occasion. Mr. Ranter too, who I afterwards learned was a player, displayed his talents, by mimicking my air, features, and voice, while he returned my compliment. This feat I should not have been so sensible of, had I not seen him behave in the same manner to my friend Wagtail, when he made up to them at first. But for once I let him enjoy the fruits of his dexterity without question or control, resolved however to chastise his insolence at a more convenient opportunity. Mr. Slyboot, guessing I was a stranger, asked if I had been lately in France. And when I answered in the affirmative, inquired if I had seen the Luxembourg Gallery. I told him I had considered it more than once with great attention. Upon this a conversion ensued, in which I discovered him to be a painter. While we were discoursing upon the particulars of this famous performance, I overheard Banter ask Dr. Wagtail, where he had picked up this Mr. Random. To which question the physician answered, "Upon my word, a mighty pretty sort of a gentleman, a man of fortune, sir. He has made the grand tour, and seen the best company in Europe, ere." "What, he told you so, I suppose?" said the other. "I take him to be neither more nor less than a French valet de chambre." "Oh, barbarous, barbarous," cried the doctor, "this is actually, upon my word, altogether unaccountable. I know all his family perfectly well, sir. He is of the Randoms of the North, a very ancient house, sir, and a distant relation of mine." I was extremely nettled at the conjecture of Mr. Banter, and began to entertain a very indifferent opinion of my company in general, but, as I might possibly by their means acquire a more extensive and agreeable acquaintance, I determined to bear these little mortifications as long as I could without injuring the dignity of my character. After having talked for some time on the weather, plays, politics, and other coffee-house subjects, it was proposed that we should spend the evening at a noted tavern in the neighborhood, whither we repaired in a body. Having taken possession of a room, called for French wine, and bespoke supper, the glass went about pretty freely, and the characters of my associates opened upon me more and more. It soon appeared that the doctor was entertained as but for the painter and player to exercise their wit upon, for the diversion of the company. Mr. Ranter began the game by asking him what was good for a hoarseness, lowness of spirits, and indigestion, for he was troubled with all these complaints to a very great degree. Wagtail immediately undertook to explain the nature of his case, and in a very prolix manner harangued upon prognostics, diagnostics, symptomatics, therapeutics, inanition, and repletion, then calculated the force of the stomach and lungs in their respective operations, ascribed the player's malady to a disorder in these organs, proceeding from hard drinkings and vociferations, and prescribed a course of stomachics, with abstinence from venery, wine, loud speaking, laughing, singing, coughing, sneezing, or hallooing. "Pa, pa," cried Ranter, interrupting him, "the remedy is worse than the disease. I wish I knew where to find some tinder water." "Tinder water," said the doctor, "upon my word, I don't apprehend you, Mr. Ranter." "Water extracted from tinder," replied the other, "a universal specific for all distempers incident to man. It was invented by a learned German monk, who, for a valuable consideration, imparted the secret to Paracelsus." "Pardon me," cried the painter, "it was first used by Solomon, as appears by a Greek manuscript in his civil handwriting, lately found at the foot of Mount Lebanon, by a peasant who was digging for potatoes." "Well," said Wagtail, "in all my vast reading, I never met with such a preparation. Neither did I know till this minute, that Solomon understood Greek, or that potatoes grew in Palestine." Here Banter interposed, saying, he was surprised that Dr. Wagtail should make the least doubt of Solomon's understanding Greek, when he is represented to us as the wisest and best educated prince in the world, and as for potatoes, they were transplanted thither from Ireland, in the time of the Crusade, by some knights of that country. "I profess," said the doctor, "there is nothing more likely. I would actually give a vast sum for a sight of that manuscript, which must be inestimable, and, if I understood the process, would set about it immediately." The player assured him the process was very simple, that he must cram 100 weight of dry tinder into a glass retort, and, distilling it by the force of animal heat, it would yield half a scruple of insipid water, 1 drop of which is a full dose. "Upon my integrity," exclaimed the incredulous doctor, "this is very amazing and extraordinary. That a caput mortuum should yield any water at all. I must own I have always been an enemy to specifics which I thought inconsistent with the nature of the animal economy, but certainly the authority of Solomon is not to be questioned. I wonder where I shall find a glass retort large enough to contain such a vast quantity of tinder, the consumption of which must, undoubtedly, raise the price of paper, or where shall I find animal heat sufficient even to warm such a mass?" Slyboot informed him, that he might have a retort blown for him as big as a church, and, that the easiest method of raising the vapor by animal heat, would be to place it in the middle of an infirmary for feverish patients, who might be upon mattresses around and in contact with it. He sooner pronounced these words, than Wagtail exclaimed in a rapture, "An admirable expedient, as I hope to be saved. I will positively put it in practice." This simplicity of the physician furnished excellent diversion for the company, who, in their turns, sneered at him in ironical compliments, which his vanity swallowed as the genuine sentiments of their hearts. Mr. Chatter, impatient of so long a silence, now broke out and entertained us with a catalogue of all the people who danced at the last Hampstead Assembly, with a most circumstantial account of the dress and ornaments of each, from the lappets of the ladies to the shoe buckles of the men, concluding with telling Bragwell, that his mistress Melinda was there, and seemed to miss him, and soliciting his company at the next occasion of that kind. "No, said Bragwell, "I have something else to mind than dangling after a parcel of giddy-headed girls. Besides, you know my temper is so unruly, that I am apt to involve myself in scrapes when a woman is concerned. The last time I was there, I had an affair with Tom Trippitt." "Oh. I remember that," cried Banter. "You lugged out before the ladies, and I commend you for so doing, because you had an opportunity of showing your manhood without running any risk." "Risk," said the other with a fierce countenance, "and my blood. I fear no risks. I ain't afraid of lugging out against any man that wears a head, me. 'Tis well known that I have drawn blood more than once, and lost some too, but what does that signify?" The player begged this champion to employ him as his second the next time he intended to kill, for he wanted to see a man die of a stab, that he might know how to act such an art the more naturally on the stage. "Die," replied the hero, "no, by G. I know better things than to incur the verdict of a Middlesex jury. I should look upon my fencing master to be an ignorant son of a b.h., if he had not taught me to prick any of my antagonist's body that I please to disable." "Oh ho," cried Sly Boot, "if that be the case, I have a favor to ask. You must know I am employed to paint a Jesus on the cross, and my purpose is to represent him at that point of time when the spear is thrust into his side. Now I should be glad if you would, in my presence, pink some impertinent fellow into convulsions, without endangering his life, that I may have an opportunity of taking a good clever agony from nature. The doctor will direct you where to enter and how far to go, but pray let it be as near the left side as possible." Wagtail, who took this proposal seriously, observed that it would be a very difficult matter to penetrate into the left side of the thorax without hurting the heart, and in consequence killing the patient, but he believed it was possible for a man of a very nice hand and exact knowledge of anatomy, to wound the diaphragma somewhere about the skirts, which might induce a singultus, without being attended with death, that he was ready to demonstrate the insertion of that muscle to Mr. Bragwell, but desired to have no concern with the experiment, which might essentially prejudice his reputation, in case of a miscarriage. Bragwell was as much imposed upon by the painter's waggery as the doctor, and declined engaging in the affair, saying he held a very great regard for Mr. Slyboot, but had laid it down as a maxim, never to fight except when his honor was engaged. 1,000 jokes of this kind were uttered, the wine circulated, supper was served in, we ate heartily, returned to the bottle, Bragwell became noisy and troublesome, Banter grew more and more severe, Ranter rehearsed, Slyboot made faces at the whole company, I sang French catches, and Chatter kissed me with great affection, while the doctor, with a woeful countenance, sat silent like a disciple of Pythagoras. At length, it was proposed by Bragwell, that we should scour the hundreds, sweat the constable, maul the watch, and then reel soberly to bed. While we deliberated upon this expedition, the waiter came into the room, and asked for Dr. Wagtail. When he understood he was present, he told him there was a lady below to inquire for him, at which message the physician started from his melancholy contemplation, and, with a look of extreme confusion, assured the company he could not possibly be the person wanted, for he had no connection with any lady whatever, and bade the drawer tell her so. "For shame," cried Banter, "would you be so impolite as to refuse a lady a hearing? Perhaps she comes for a consultation. It must be some extraordinary affair that brings a lady to a tavern at this time of night. Mr. Ranter, pray do the doctor's base mains to the lady, and squire her hither." The player immediately staggered out, and returned, leading in with much ceremony, a tall strapping wench, whose appearance proclaimed her occupation. We received her with the utmost solemnity, and with a good deal of entreaty she was persuaded to sit, when a profound silence ensued, during which she fixed her eyes, with a disconsolate look, upon the doctor, who was utterly confounded at her behavior, and returned her melancholy fourfold. At length, after a good many piteous sighs, she wiped her eyes, and accosted him thus: "What? Not one word of comfort? Will nothing soften that stony heart of thine? Not all my tears? Not all my affliction? Not the inevitable ruin thou hast brought upon me? Where are thy vows, thou faithless, perjured man? Hast thou no honor, no conscience, no remorse for thy perfidious conduct towards me? Answer me, wilt thou at last do me justice, or must I have recourse to heaven or hell for my revenge? If poor Wagtail was amazed before she spoke, what must his confusion be on hearing this address? His natural paleness changed into a ghastly clay color, his eyes rolled, his lip trembled, and he answered in an accent not to be described, "Upon my word, honor, and salvation, madam, you are actually mistaken in my person. I have a most particular veneration for your sex, and am actually incapable of injuring any lady in the smallest degree, madam. Besides, madam, to the best of my recollection, I never had the honor of seeing you before, as I hope to be saved, madam." "How, traitor," cried she, "dost thou disown me then?" "Mistaken? No, too well I know that fair bewitching face. Too well I know that false enchanting tongue. Alas! Gentlemen, since the villain compels me by his unkindness, to expose myself and him, know that this betrayer, under the specious pretense of honorable addresses, won my heart, and taking advantage of his conquest, robbed me of my virgin treasure, and afterwards abandoned me to my fate. I am now 4 months gone with child by him, turned out of doors by my relations, and left a prey to misery and want. Yes, thou barbarian," said she, turning to Wagtail, "thou tiger, thou succubus. Too well thou knowest my situation. But I will tear out thy faithless heart, and deliver the world from such a monster." So saying, she sprang forward at the doctor, who with incredible agility, jumped over the table, and ran behind Bragwell, while the rest of us endeavored to appease the furious heroine. Although everybody in the company affected the utmost surprise, I could easily perceive it was a scheme concerted among them to produce diversion at the doctor's expense, and being under no concern about the consequence, I entered into the confederacy, and enjoyed the distress of Wagtail, who with tears in his eyes begged the protection of the company, declaring himself as innocent of the crime laid to his charge as the fetus in utero, and hinting at the same time, that nature had not put it in his power to be guilty of such a trespass. "Nature," cried the lady, "there was no nature in the case. He abused me by the help of charms and spells, else how is it possible that any woman could have listened to the addresses of such a scarecrow? Were these owlish eyes made for ogling, that carrion complexion to be admired, or that mouth, like a horseshoe, to be kissed? No, no, you owe your success to your philters, to your drugs and incantations, and not to your natural talents, which are, in every respect, mean and contemptible." The doctor thought he had got an opportunity of vindicating himself effectually, and desired the complainant to compose herself but for half an hour, in which he undertook to prove the absurdity of believing in the power of incantations, which were only idle dreams of ignorance and superstition. He accordingly pronounced a very learned discourse upon the nature of ideas, the power and independence of the mind, the properties of stimulating medicines, the difference between a proneness to venery, which many simples would create, and a passion limited to one object, which can only be the result of sense and reflection, and concluded with a pathetic remonstrance, setting forth his unhappiness in being persecuted with the resentment of a lady whom he had never injured, nor even seen before that occasion, and whose faculties were, in all likelihood, so much impaired by her misfortunes that an innocent person was in danger of being ruined by her disorder. He had no sooner finished his harangue, than the forlorn princess renewed her lamentations, and cautioned the company against his eloquence, which, she said, was able to bias the most impartial bench in Christendom. Ranter advised him to espouse her immediately, as the only means to save his reputation, and offered to accompany him to the Fleet for that purpose, but Slyboot proposed that a father should be purchased for the child, and a comfortable alimony settled on the mother. Ranter promised to adopt the infant gratis. Wagtail was ready to worship him for his generosity, and, though he persisted in protesting his innocence, condescended to everything rather than his unblemished character should be called into question. The lady rejected the proposal, and insisted on matrimony. Bragwell took up the cudgels for the doctor, and undertook to rid him of her importunity for half a guinea, upon which Wagtail, with great eagerness, pulled out his purse, and put it into the hand of his friend, who, taking half a piece out of it, gave it to the plaintiff, and bade her thank God for her good fortune. When she had received this bounty, she affected to weep, and begged, since the physician had renounced her, he would at least vouchsafe her a parting kiss. This he was prevailed upon to grant with great reluctance, and went up with his usual solemnity to salute her, when she laid hold of his cheek with her teeth, and held fast, while he roared with anguish, to the unspeakable diversion of all present. When she thought proper to release him, she dropped a low courtesy to the company, and quitted the room, leaving the doctor in the utmost horror, not so much on account of the pain, as the apprehension of the consequence of the bite, for, by this time, he was convinced of her being mad. Banter prescribed the actual cautery, and put the poker in the fire to be heated, in order to sear the place. The player was of opinion that Bragwell should scoop out the part affected with the point of his sword, but the painter prevented both these dreadful operations by recommending a balsam he had in his pocket, which never failed to cure the bite of a mad dog. So saying, he pulled out a small bladder of black paint, with which he instantly anointed not only the sore, but the greatest part of the patient's face, and left it in a frightful condition. In short, the poor creature was so harassed with fear and vexation, that I pitied him extremely, and sent him home in a chair, contrary to the inclination of everybody present. This freedom of mine gave umbrage to Bragwell, who testified his displeasure by swearing a few threats, without making any application, which, being perceived by Slyboot, who sat by me, he, with a view of promoting a quarrel, whispered to me, that he thought Bragwell used me very ill, but every man was the best judge of his own affairs. I answered aloud, that I would neither suffer Mr. Bragwell nor him to use me ill with impunity, and that I stood in no need of his counsel in regard to the regulation of my conduct. He thought proper to ask 1,000 pardons, and assure me he meant no offence, while Bragwell feigned himself asleep, that he might not be obliged to take notice of what passed. But the player, who had more animal spirits and less discretion than Slyboot, unwilling to let the affair rest where he had dropped it, jogged Mr. Bragwell and told him softly that I had called him names, and threatened to cudgel him. This particular I understood by his starting up and crying, "Blood and wounds, you lie. No man durst treat me so ignominiously. Mr. Random, did you call me names, and threaten to drub me?" I denied the imputation, and proposed to punish the scoundrel who endeavored to foment disturbance in the company. Bragwell signified his approbation, and drew his sword. I did the same, and accosted the actor in these words: "Look'ee, Mr. Ranter, I know you possess all the mimicry and mischievous qualities of an ape, because I have observed you put them all in practice more than once tonight, on me and others. Now I want to see if you resemble one in nimbleness also, therefore, I desire you leap over this sword without hesitation." So saying, I held it parallel to the horizon, at the distance of about 3 feet from the floor, and called, once, twice, thrice, and away, but, instead of complying with my demand, he snatched his hat and hanger, and, assuming the looks, swagger, and phrase of pistol, burst out into the following exclamation: "Ha! Must I then perform inglorious prank of sylvan ape in mountain forest caught? Death rock me asleep, abridge my doleful days, and lay my head in fury's lap, have we not Hiren here?" This buffoonery did not answer his expectation, for, by this time, the company was bent on seeing him in a new character. Mr. Banter desired me to hold my sword a foot or 2 higher, that he might have the better opportunity of exerting himself. The painter told him, if he performed well, he would recommend him as a vaulter to the proprietors of Sadler's Wells, and Bragwell, crying, "Leap for the king," applied the point of his sword to the player's posteriors with such success, that he sprang over in a trice, and, finding the door unguarded, vanished in a twinkling, glad, no doubt, of having paid his share of the reckoning so easily. It being now near 2 o'clock in the morning, we discharged the bill, and sallied out into the street. The painter slunk away without taking his leave. Billy Chatter, being unable to speak or stand, was sent to a bagnio, and Banter and I accompanied Bragwell to Moll King's coffee house, where after he had kicked 6 hungry whores, we left him asleep on a bench, and directed our course towards Charing Cross, near which place both he and I lodged. The natural dryness of my companion being overcome by liquor, he honored me by the way with many compliments and professions of friendship, for which I made suitable acknowledgments, and told him I thought myself happy in having, by my behavior, removed the unfavorable opinion he entertained of me at first sight. He was surprised at this declaration, and begged me to explain myself, upon which I mentioned what I had overheard him say of me to Wagtail in the coffee-house. He laughed, and made an apology for his freedom, assuring me that my appearance had very much prepossessed him in my favor, and what he said was only intended as a joke on the doctor's solemnity. I was highly pleased at being undeceived in this particular, and not a little proud of the good opinion of this wit, who shook me by the hand at parting, and promised to meet me the next day at the ordinary. Chapter 47. Strap communicates to me a conquest he had made of a chandler's widow, finds himself miserably mistaken. I go to the opera, admire Melinda, am cautioned by Banter, go to the assembly at Hampstead, dance with that young lady, receive an insolent message from Bragwell, whose mettle is soon cooled, am in favour with my mistress, whom I visit next day, and am bubbled out of 18 guineas at cards. Strap triumphs at my success, but is astonished at my expense. Banter comes to my lodging, is very sarcastic at my expense, and borrows 5 guineas from me, as a proof of his friendship. Indiana. The morning, before I got up, Strap came into my chamber, and, finding me awake, hemmed several times, scratched his head, cast his eyes upon the ground, and, with a very foolish kind of simper upon his face, gave me to understand he had something to communicate. By your countenance, said I expect to hear good tidings. Indifferently, replied he, tittering, that is, hereafter as it shall be. You must know, I have some thoughts of altering my condition. What, cried I, astonished, a matrimonial scheme? O rare Strap! Thou hast got the heels of me at last. No less, I assure you, said he, bursting into a laugh of self-approbation. A tallow chandler's widow that lives hard by, has taken a liking to me, a fine jolly dame, as plump as a partridge. She has a well-furnished house, a brisk trade, and a good deal of the ready. I may have her for the asking. She told a friend of mine, a brother footman, that she would take me out of a stinking clout. But I refused to give my final answer, till I knew your opinion of the matter. I congratulated Monsieur d'Estrapes upon his conquest, and approved of the scheme, provided he could be assured of those circumstances of her fortune, but advised him to do nothing rashly, and give me an opportunity of seeing the lady before matters should be brought to a conclusion. He assured me he would do nothing without my consent and approbation, and that very morning, while I was at breakfast, introduce his inamorata to my acquaintance. She was a short thick woman, about the age of 36, and had a particular prominence of belly, which I perceived at first sight, not without some suspicion of foul play. I desired her, however, to sit, and treated her with a dish of tea, the discourse turning on the good qualities of Strap, whom I represented as a prodigy of sobriety, industry, and virtue. When she took her leave, he followed her to the door, and returned licking his lips, and asking if I did not think she was a luscious creature. I made no mystery of my apprehension, but declared my sentiments of her without reserve, at which he was not surprised, telling me he had observed the same symptom, but was informed by his friend that she was only liver-grown and would in few months be as small in the waist as ever. Yes, said I, a few weeks, I believe, will do the business. In short, Strap, it is my opinion, that you are egregiously imposed upon, and that this friend is no other than a rascal who wants to palm his troll upon you for a wife, that he may at once deliver himself from the importunities of the mother and the expense of her bantling, for which reason I would not have you trust implicitly to the report he makes of her wealth, which is inconsistent with his behavior, nor run your head precipitately into a noose, that you may afterwards wish exchanged for the hangman's. He seemed very much startled at my insinuation, and promised to look twice before he leaped, saying, with some heat, odds, if I find his intention is to betray me, we shall see which of us is the better man. My prediction was verified in less than a fortnight, her great belly producing an infant, to the unspeakable amazement of Strap, who was before this happened, inclinable to believe I had refined a little too much in my penetration. His false friend disappeared, and a few days after an execution was issued against her goods and household furniture, which were seized by the creditors. Meanwhile I met my friend Banter at the ordinary, and in the evening went to the opera with him and Mr. Chatter, who pointed out Melinda in one of the boxes, and offered to introduce me to her, observing at the same time that she was a reigning toast worth £10,000. This piece of information made my heart bound with joy, and I discovered great eagerness to accept the proposal, upon which he assured me I should dance with her at the next assembly, if he had any influence in that quarter. So saying, he went round, spoke to her some minutes, and, as I imagined, pointed at me, then returning, told me, to my inexpressible pleasure, that I might depend upon what he had promised, for she was now engaged as my partner. Banter in a whisper gave me to understand that she was an incorrigible coquette, who would grant the same favor to any young fellow in England of a tolerable appearance, merely to engage him among the herd of her admirers, that she might have the pleasure of seeing them daily increase, that she was of a cold and sensible disposition, dead to every passion but vanity, and so blind to merit, that he would lay any wager the wealthiest fool would carry her at last. I attributed a good deal of this intelligence to the satirical turn of my friend, or resentment for having himself suffered a rebuff from the lady in question, and, at any rate, trusted so much to my own accomplishments as to believe no woman could resist the ardor of my addresses. Full of this confidence I repaired to Hampstead in company with Billy Chatter, my Lord Hobble, and Dr. Wagtail. There I saw a very brilliant assembly, before whom I had the honor to walk a minuet with Melinda, who charmed me with her frank manner and easiness of behavior. Before the country dances began, I received a message by a person I did not know from Bragwell, who was present, importing that nobody who knew him presumed to dance with Melinda while he was there in person, that I would do well to relinquish her without noise, because he had a mind to lead up a country dance with her. This extraordinary intimation, which was delivered in the lady's hearing, did not at all discompose me, who, by this time, was pretty well acquainted with the character of my rival. I therefore, without the least symptom of concern, bade the gentleman tell Mr. Bragwell, that since I was so happy as to obtain the lady's consent, I should not be solicitous about his, and desired the bearer himself to bring me no such impertinent messages for the future. Melinda affected a sort of confusion, and pretended to wonder that Mr. Bragwell should give himself such liberties with regard to her, who had no manner of connection with the fellow. I laid hold of this opportunity to display my valor, and offered to call him to an account for his insolence, a proposal which she absolutely refused, under pretence of consulting my safety, though I could perceive, by the sparkling of her eyes, that she would not have thought herself affronted by being the subject of a duel. I was by no means pleased with this discovery of her thoughts, which not only argued the most unjustifiable vanity, but likewise the most barbarous indifference. However, I was allured by her fortune, and resolved to gratify her pride, in making her the occasion of a public quarrel between me and Bragwell, who, I was pretty certain, would never drive matters to a dangerous extremity. While we danced together, I observed this formidable rival at one end of the room, encircled with a cluster of beaux, to whom he talked with great vehemence, casting many big looks at me from time to time. I guessed the subject of his discourse, and as soon as I had handed my partner to her seat, strutted up to the place where he stood, and, cocking my hat in his face, demanded aloud, if he had anything to say to me. He answered with a sullen tone, "Nothing, at present, sir," and turned about upon his heel. "Well," said I, "you know where I am to be found at any time." His companions stared at one another, and I returned to the lady, whose features brightened at my approach, and immediately a whisper ran through the whole room, after which so many eyes were turned upon me that I was ready to sink with confusion. When the ball broke up, I led her to her coach, and, like a true French gallant, would have got up behind it, in order to protect her from violence on the road, but she absolutely refused my offer, and expressed her concern that there was not an empty seat for me within the vehicle. Next day, in the afternoon, I waited on her at her lodgings, by permission, in company with Chatter, and was very civilly received by her mother, with whom she lived. There were a good many fashionable people present, chiefly young fellows, and immediately after tea, a couple of card tables were set, at one of which I had the honor to play with Melinda, who in less than 3 hours, made shift to plunder me of 8 guineas. I was well enough content to lose a little money with a good grace, that I might have an opportunity in the meantime to say soft things, which are still most welcome when attended with good luck, but I was by no means satisfied of her fair play, a circumstance that shocked me not a little, and greatly impaired my opinion of her disinterestedness and delicacy. However, I was resolved to profit by this behavior, and treat her in my turn with less ceremony. Accordingly, I laid close siege to her, and, finding her not at all disgusted with the gross incense I offered, that very night made a declaration of love in plain terms. She received my addresses with great gaiety, and pretended to laugh them off, but at the same time treated me with such particular complacency that I was persuaded I had made a conquest of her heart and concluded myself the happiest man alive. Elevated with these flattering ideas, I sat down again to cards after supper, and with great cheerfulness suffered myself to be cheated of 10 guineas more. It was late before I took my leave, after being favoured with a general invitation, and, when I got into bed, the adventures of the day hindered me from sleeping. Sometimes I pleased myself with the hopes of possessing a fine woman with £10,000, then I would ruminate on the character I had heard of her from Banter, and compare it with the circumstances of her conduct towards me, which seemed to bear too great a resemblance to the picture he had drawn. This introduced a melancholy reflection on the expense I had undergone, and the smallness of my funds to support it, which, by the by, were none of my own. In short, I found myself involved in doubts and perplexities, that kept me awake the greatest part of the night. In the morning, Strap, with whom I had not conversed for 2 days, presented himself with the utensils for shaving me, upon which, I asked his opinion of the lady he had seen me conduct to her coach at Hampstead. "Odds! She's a delicious creature," cried he, "and, as I am informed, a great fortune. I am sorry you did not insist on going home with her. I dare say, she would not have refused your company, for she seems to be a good-humoured soul." "There's a time for all things," said I. "You must know, Strap, I was in company with her till 1 o'clock this morning." I had no sooner pronounced these words than he began to caper about the room, and snap his fingers, crying in a transport, "The day's our own, the day's our own." I gave him to understand that his triumph was a little premature, and that I had more difficulties to surmount than he was aware of. Then I recounted to him the intelligence I had received from Banter. At which he changed colour, shook his head, and observed there was no faith in woman. I told him I was resolved to make a bold push notwithstanding, although I foresaw it would lead me into a great expense, and bade him guess the sum I had lost last night at cards. He scratched his chin, and protested his abhorrence of cards, the very name of which being mentioned, made him sweat with vexation, as it recalled the money-dropper to his remembrance. "But, however," said he, "you have to do with other guess people now. Why, I suppose, if you had a bad run last night, you would scarce come off for less than 10 or 12 shilling." I was mortified at this piece of simplicity, which I imagined, at that time, was all affected by way of reprimand for my folly, and asked with some heat if he thought I had spent the evening in a cellar with chairmen and bunters, giving him to know, at the same time, that my expense had amounted to 18 guineas. It would require the pencil of Hogarth to express the astonishment and concern of Strap on hearing this piece of news. The basin, in which he was preparing the lather for my chin, dropped out of his hands, and he remained some time immovable in that ludicrous attitude, with his mouth open, and his eyes thrust forward considerably beyond their station. But, remembering my disposition, which was touchy, and impatient of control, he smothered his chagrin, and attempted to recollect himself. With this view he endeavoured to laugh, but in spite of his teeth, broke out in a whimper, took up his washball and pewter pot, scrubbed my beard with the one, and discharged the other upon my face. I took no notice of this confusion, but after he had fully recovered himself, put him in mind of his right, and assured him of my readiness to surrender my effects whenever he should think proper to demand them. He was nettled at my insinuation, which he thought proceeded from my distrust of his friendship, and begged I would never talk to him in that strain again, unless I had a mind to break his heart. This good creature's unalterable friendship for me affected me with the most grateful sentiments, and acted as a spur to my resolution of acquiring a fortune, that I might have it in my power to manifest my generosity in my turn. For this purpose, I determined to bring matters to a speedy conclusion with Melinda, well knowing that a few such nights as the last would effectually incapacitate me from prosecuting that or any other advantageous amour. While my meditation was busied in planning out my future conduct, Mr. Banter favored me with a visit, and after breakfast asked how I had passed the preceding evening. I answered I was very agreeably entertained at a private house. Yes, said he, with a sarcastic smile, you deserve something extraordinary for the price you paid. I was surprised at this remark, and pretended ignorance of his meaning. Come, Mr. Random, continued he, you need not make a mystery of it to me, the whole town has it. I wish that foolish affair between you and Bragwell at Hampstead had been less public. It has set all the busybodies at work to find out your real character and situation, and you cannot imagine what conjectures have already circulated at your expense. One suspects you to be a Jesuit in disguise, another thinks you are an agent from the Pretender, a third believes you to be an upstart gamester, because nobody knows anything of your family or fortune, a fourth is of opinion that you are an Irish fortune hunter. This last hypothesis touched me so nearly that, to conceal my confusion, I was fain to interrupt his detail, and damn the world for an envious meddling community, that would not suffer a gentleman to live without molestation. He took no notice of this apostrophe, but went on. For my own part, I neither know nor desire to know who or what you are. This I am certain of, that few people make a mystery of their origin or situation, who can boast of anything advantageous in either, and my own opinion of the matter is that you have raised yourself, by your industry, from nothing to the appearance you now maintain, and which you endeavor to support by some matrimonial scheme. Here he fixed his eyes steadfastly upon me and perceiving my face covered with blushes, told me, how he was confirmed in his opinion. Look ye, Random, said he, I have divined your plan, and am confident it will never succeed. You are too honest and too ignorant of the town to practice the necessary cheats of your profession, and detect the conspiracies that will be formed against you. Besides, you are downright bashful. What the devil? Set up for a fortune hunter before you have conquered the sense of shame. Perhaps you are entitled by your merit, and I believe you are, to a richer and a better wife than Melinda, but take my word for it, she is not to be won at that rate, or, if you are so lucky as to carry her, between you and me, you may say, as Teague said, by my soul, I have gained a loss. She would take care to spend her fortune in a twinkling, and soon make you sick of her extravagance. I was alarmed by his discourse, while I resented the freedom of it, and expressed my disgust by telling him, he was mistaken in my intentions, and desiring he would give me leave to regulate my conduct according to the dictates of my own reason. He made no apology for the liberty he had taken, and ascribed it to the warmth of his friendship for me, as an uncommon instance of which he borrowed 5 guineas, assuring me there were very few people in the world whom he would so far favor with his confidence. I gave him the money, and professed myself so well convinced of his sincerity, that he had no occasion to put it to such extraordinary proofs for the future. I thought, said he, to have asked 5 pieces more, but hearing you were bubbled of 18 last night, I presumed you might be out of cash, and resolved to model my demand accordingly. I could not help admiring the cavalier behavior of this spark, of whom I desired to know his reason for saying I was bubbled. He then gave me to understand, that before he came to my lodgings, he had beat up Tom Tossell, who, being present, informed him of the particulars, rehearsed all the fine things I said to Melinda, with which he proposed to entertain the town, and among other circumstances, assured him my mistress cheated with so little art, that nobody but a mere novice could be imposed upon. The thoughts of becoming a subject of raillery for coxcombs, and losing my money to boot, stung me to the quick, but I made a virtue of my indignation, and swore that no man should with impunity either asperse the character of Melinda, or turn my behavior into ridicule. He replied in a dry manner, that I would find it a Herculean task to chastise everybody who should laugh at my expense, and, as for the character of Melinda, he did not see how it could suffer by what was laid to her charge, for that cheating at cards, far from being reckoned a blemish among people of fashion, was looked upon as an honorable indication of superior genius and address. But let us waive this subject, said he, and go to the coffee-house, in order to make a party for dinner.